Hello and welcome back to the Octane C4D Master Course. I am John Burdock of Epic J Creations, and in this video we're going to be learning about a piece of software called Octane Render. So to begin, let's start by asking the question, what is Octane Render? Octane Render is an external ray trace GPU render engine. Now, I know this is a bit of a mouthful, but all these words mean is at the most basic level, Octane takes raw, unprocessed geometry, like these spheres and cubes here. They can be made in most 3D applications, and then you can take this geometry and process this geometry to create effects and detail that are normally more physically accurate. Now, render engines do not always have to create physically accurate effects. They can also create stylized effects, like 2D drawings and paintings, like the Cinema 4D Sketch and Tune render engine, for example. Octane, however, does try to make everything it renders look more physically accurate. For example, we can see Octane has created realistic refraction, shadows here on the floor, caustics, colored absorption, we can see on this sphere here, glossy reflections on top of our different colored spheres back here, and we can even see a perfect example of matte diffuse materials here with color variations. We have different colors on our cubes here. On top of all this, Octane can also create volumetric VDB volumes, such as fire, smoke, and clouds. This is a really cool feature that Octane added in version 3.0 and later. I also want to point out, this is all just a taste of some of the effects that Octane can create, and we are going to be learning a lot more about them as we go further into this course. With this all said, now that we know what Octane Render Engine does, let's talk about what it can't do. Octane Render cannot create its own geometry. This means you have to create your geometry in a 3D application, like Cinema 4D, and then import that geometry into Octane. For example, here is Cinema 4D out of the box. You can do modeling, animation, dynamic simulation, MoGraph, lighting, camera post effects, and even rendering. With Octane, on the other hand, you can only do rendering, camera post effects, lighting, and Octane scatter. You cannot do MoGraph, dynamic simulation, animation, or modeling. That part is all handled by Cinema 4D. Now that we know what Octane can't do, let's talk about the different ways we can use Octane Render. First off, Octane is not like your average render engine, as there is multiple ways of using it. In fact, there is actually two distinct ways of using Octane Render. The first way is using the standard Octane Render application. With this workflow, you start in your 3D application of choice, such as Cinema 4D, for example, here, and you create your raw geometry. Say, for example, we have this sphere here. You then take this geometry and you export this out of your 3D application and you import it in to Octane Render standalone. You then process that geometry and you have your final render. The problem happens when we decide we'd like to make changes to our geometry. Say, for example, we would like to change our sphere into a cube. To do this, we would have to delete this from Octane Render, hop back into our 3D application, make a cube, re-export that back out, re-import that back into Octane, and then reprocess that to have our final render. This process is slow and can be very frustrating for an artist that is used to rendering with a dedicated render engine inside their software. This is why a lot of artists prefer to use the second way of using Octane Render, and this is by additionally purchasing an Octane plugin for your 3D application of choice. As you can see, Octane has plugins for many different types of 3D software. The one we are going to be focusing on, though, is the Cinema 4D Octane plugin. We're going to be focusing so much on this plugin, in fact, that we are going to spend the entire course using nothing other than the Cinema 4D version of Octane Render. We are not going to be hopping in the standalone application whatsoever. Now, I do want to point out, no matter how you plan on using Octane Render, you must first purchase the Octane standalone application, or you will not be able to use any of the Octane plugins. This means you must purchase Octane standalone first, and then purchase one of the plugins for that plugin to work. This may seem like a strange way of doing it, But this way, you can later purchase multiple plugins and use them with the same standalone Octane Render license. Now that we understand all this, let's talk about how the addition of this plugin can change our workflow. We start out just as we did before in our 3D application of choice, for example again Cinema 4D, and we create our raw geometry, a sphere again for example. Instead of manually having to export this out and bring this into the Octane standalone application, we can simply select a single button inside of the Octane Render plugin, and it will automatically export out our geometry, import it into Octane standalone, and then Octane standalone will then export out this finished render and bring it back into Cinema 4D, giving us the exact same final render as if we were using the standalone workflow. Now, what's really impressive about this is on top of just automatically exporting and importing this geometry, which may I point out is extremely efficient and fast, giving you results and exporting and importing that geometry with over 30 times a second in some tests I've done, which is extremely quick. It can also convert data that's inside of Cinema 4D. For example, you can use Octane Scatter in the Cinema 4D plugin, and you can then use Cinema 4D effectors with Octane Scatter. This can only happen if you have the Cinema 4D plugin of Octane though, because the plugin will convert the Cinema 4D MoGraph effectors and make it compatible with Octane Scatter in the standalone application. As you can see here, this is another good point to show why we must have the standalone version of Octane for it to actually work with our plugin, because the plugin is simply just exporting that out and then bringing it back in. This said though, you don't even know that the standalone application is running. In fact, you do not have to boot it up. You simply just launch Cinema 4D and it'll boot up with the plugin, and Octane standalone will boot up behind doors without you even knowing about it. Now that we understand these two workflow options, I want to slightly change the subject to talk about what powers render engines. By this I mean what hardware inside your computer actually makes the calculations to make your render engine work. There's multiple ways, there's actually multiple pieces of hardware that can do this. The first one is your Central Processing Unit, or CPU. And the second one is your Graphics Processing Unit, or GPU. Now, if you're using the Cinema 4D standard or physical render engines, along with many other render engines out there, they all use the CPU. That said, Octane Render, along with a few other render engines out there, use your GPU. What does this mean? This means if you have Cinema 4D right now and you're rendering with a standard or physical render and you have no problems whatsoever and it's rendering super quick, this does not mean you're going to be able to use Octane Render. This is because these are two completely different pieces of hardware. This said, the opposite is also true. If you have Cinema 4D and it's rendering super slow and it's really not doing a great job for you, that does not mean that you can't run Octane Render, because your graphic card is completely separate from using your CPU. Now, I do want to point out, just because you have a graphic card does not mean you're going to be able to render with Octane. This is because Octane cannot render with AMD GPUs. So if you have an AMD Radeon, an AMD Fire Pro, an HD series, an RX series, etc., you sadly cannot render with Octane Render, I'm afraid. That said, if you have a NVIDIA graphic card like a GeForce or a Quadro, and it does not matter how old they are, you could have a GeForce 580M in a laptop that's like 5-8 years old, it will work in Octane Render. And you could go all the way up to have a GTX 1080 if you want. Those will all work, everything in between. That said, you are going to notice a massive speed difference between a 580 and a 1080, but that said, they both will be compatible. Now that we have gone over all of this information, let's finish everything up by going over what did we just learn. We just learned Octane Render processes geometry to create realistic effects and detail. We also learned Octane uses geometry to render. It cannot make its own. We learned Octane has other plugins that speed up our workflow. And we also learned Octane can only render with NVIDIA GPUs.